During the Lunch Bunch segment of the program, I want to discuss a couple of topics, a couple of environmental issues. One of them, which comes from the Living Oceans Society, has to do with oil tanker traffic or the potential of it on our coasts. But first off, I want to talk to the Sierra Club of BC because they've just released a report which is urging changes to the way we manage forests and deal with forests because apparently BC's coastal forests, according to the Sierra Club, is a large source of unaccounted carbon emissions. Joining me on the line to explain this is Jens Wieting. He is the coastal forest campaigner for the Sierra Club of BC. Jens, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
I guess my first question for you today is, how are BC's forests a carbon emitter? Aren't forests supposed to be cleaning the air, taking in carbon and releasing oxygen?
Absolutely, and fortunately they are still doing that. But what we found is that BC's coastal rainforests are not only amazing in terms of species diversity and very big trees, remarkable species like the rare white spirit bear, other species of bears, deer, salmon, so many remarkable species and amazing diversity. But we also have very high carbon storage per hectare, up to 1,000 tons per hectare in old-growth forests that have accumulated carbon for thousands of years.
So when you say carbon storage, that means the carbon that is in the trees?
Exactly. It's in the trees and it's in the soils. It's in living trees and in dead trees. If you imagine an old-growth forest, you have amazing structures with, of course, these trees that are big as skyscrapers, and even in the dead trees, they continue to store carbon, sometimes hundreds of years. So you have a very amazing system, and it's very resilient as well. So, for example, along the coast, we don't see the temperature changes that we are expecting in the interior. We don't have the mountain pine beetle problem along the coast. There's rarely a fire problem. So what we already knew, what we already heard about is that BC's forests in general have become a carbon source because of the mountain pine beetle, because of fires, and logging, of course, contributes to emissions from forests. Only a portion of the carbon stored in trees continues to be stored in wood products, but a large amount of carbon is emitted into the atmosphere after logging. There's a lot of waste, unfortunately. There's mill residue and many other forms how carbon is being emitted. And for the first time, we looked at data that compares how coastal forests are doing compared to the other ecosystems in the province. And what we found is that about half of the carbon emissions from our forest lands are coming from the coast, where we don't have the mountain pine beetle. And it's mainly a question of logging, of forest management, where we have a lot of power. Problem with the mountain pine beetle is, to a certain level, we cannot do much about it right now. There are now a lot of dead trees that will continue to release carbon, but we have tremendous opportunities to reduce emissions from logging along the coast.
Now, how do you do that? Because just saying everybody stop logging probably won't work. Is there a plan that would work for everybody to, on one hand, deal with the unaccounted carbon emissions coming from our coastal forests, but on the other hand, still allow logging to go ahead? Is there a happy medium that you see?
Absolutely. The first important point to address here is that carbon loss and logging don't have to go hand in hand. You have to imagine on the one end of the spectrum, for example, logging in an old-growth forest that was undisturbed for thousands of years. And if it's a clear cut, you have very high emissions from logging. On the other end of the spectrum, we already have many second-growth forests. And if we carefully manage the second-growth forest, for example, if you choose the trees very carefully, selectively, that you want to log, you can get a significant amount of volume out of a forest, and that forest can actually continue to increase its carbon storage. You just avoid to create a lot of damage. You don't leave behind a lot of waste. You reduce the risk of fire, because after logging there's often an increased risk of fire in a dry summer, for example. So there are lots of things that we can do and we must do, because we have a climate crisis. We have very little time left to reduce emissions from all sectors, from all kind of activities. And forests are so remarkable because not only can we reduce emissions from our activities in forests, we can and we have to ensure that they are becoming a carbon sink again, that they sequester more carbon out of the atmosphere than they release annually. And our coastal forests are a key asset in this strategy.
So the main point, the main argument would be to avoid old growth logging and log the second growth or newer growth.
That's the important part of it. So you increase conservation, and of course you will have a discussion about it. How quickly are you doing it, and where are you doing it first? And that's where species come at play. So we have also, as part of our report, looked at species at risk of extinction because of a lack of old growth. We have different types of forest, and on Vancouver Island, that's the most critical region along the coast. We have about 1 million hectares of the island covered by forest types, for example, Douglas fir ecosystems, that have now so little old growth left, in some cases less than 10%, and what we found as a critical number, 30%, is where high risk for species extinction begins. And if you look at that, then you get something like a blueprint for an approach, because that tells you that these are the ecosystems where you should immediately set aside the remaining old growth, and you actually have to do some restoration. You have to identify older second growth forests with some old trees that you should also set aside to ensure that species are having at least a fighting chance to adapt to a changing climate. And this way you can do both. Set aside forest for carbon storage and protect species habitat, and you have a blueprint for and a solution where you should change your forest management and choose the right places for forestry and for logging. And of course you will need government support for that, not only in terms of planning and identifying the right areas, but also the right incentives and the right regulation that creates a level playing field for the forestry operators. And there's a lot you can do in terms of incentives to ensure that forestry can continue in the right places.
I'm talking to Jens Wieting. He is the Coastal Forest Campaigner with the Sierra Club of BC. Jens, the argument that we should protect old-growth forests in BC from logging, in particular on the coast, we've been hearing that from environmentalists for a very long time. An old-growth forest should stay. Here's another argument for that, the argument that they are a huge carbon storage, that they store a lot of carbon, and if we cut them down, they will emit a lot of unaccounted for carbon. It's just one more argument for the same goal we've been hearing. Do you think this argument will get any more traction than other ones you've had?
I think that we are seeing more and more awareness. Of course, climate change is an important topic in this context, and people are getting it. And we just learned that 2010 was the hottest year ever in Canada, hottest year since recordings began, I should add. So at least over the last 100 years. And what we are seeing is that if we don't get a handle on our emissions, if we will get to dangerous tipping points, and then we are at a risk of losing our forests, because when we cross these dangerous temperature levels, then our forests will not be able to adapt. There's a risk of forests dying off and releasing huge amounts of additional carbon into the atmosphere. That's what we would refer to as a positive feedback. Not positive for us, it's a positive feedback where the increasing carbon emissions, increasing temperatures are leading to more carbon emissions and higher temperatures, and we have to do everything we can, and very quickly. The next 10 years are absolutely critical to avoid these dangerous feedbacks and dangerous thresholds, and that's where we have to look at forest. And of course, there's a lot of confusion. Unfortunately, fossil fuel industry was working to confuse people about global warming, but we are seeing the temperature increasing globally, and we have to act now and look at all sources of emissions to control the problem.
Jens, we've just got a couple of minutes left. What do you do now with your findings that BC's coastal forests hold so much unaccounted carbon emissions, and if we continue to log the old growth, we will be emitting a lot more carbon than we should be? What do you do with the information now, apart from just sharing it with folks like me on a radio station or sharing it with the media? What do you do with this?
Well, we will continue to educate the public, and we will continue our conversations with government and opposition about how to implement a forest policy that addresses the challenge of global warming, species protection, and carbon storage. And it is absolutely critical this year because we just had an international meeting in Cancun, and there are new challenges, new tasks for the international community, for all countries to reduce emissions ahead. And we hope that governments will look at our information and the solutions that we are already developing in some parts of the province, like, for example, in the Great Bear Rainforest, where we have significant progress, and we have implemented a science-based approach that allowed all parties to identify solutions. We have to do similar things in all parts of the coastal rainforest and all parts of the province to protect our forests and fight global warming and protect species.
Jens Viting with the Sierra Club of BC, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much.
And
have a nice day.
We'll probably talk to you another time soon.
Thanks.
All right, Jens Viting with the Sierra Club of BC on the line with us just there.